Walter Higgins had farmed the same 110 acres for 52 years. Ever since he'd inherited the land from his own father, the same spring he'd married his wife, Colleen. The two of them had raised 3 children in the old stone farmhouse at the top of the hill, buried a lot of hard years and a few genuinely good ones out there together. And after Colleen passed 6 years back, Walter had simply kept going, the way people from that generation tended to do, quietly, without much complaint, because the land didn't stop needing him just because his heart was tired. His children had all moved on with their own lives, one to the state capital, one overseas with the military, and only his oldest son, Marcus, still lived close enough to help out most weekends, though even he had his own young family and a full-time job to manage alongside it. Walter never asked for more help than that. He'd never been the kind of man who liked owing anyone anything, which made what eventually happened all the more fitting, in a way nobody could have predicted. He wasn't a wealthy man by any measure that mattered on paper. But over 5 decades, Walter had built something else entirely, a reputation. He'd loaned equipment to half the young farmers in the county when they were starting out and couldn't afford their own, sometimes for entire growing seasons without a second thought about compensation. He'd covered a neighbour's mortgage payment for 4 months running one particularly brutal winter, never once mentioning it again once the man got back on his feet, and never once bringing it up even years later, when the 2 men saw each other at church or the feed store. He'd taught half the volunteer fire department how to properly clear a firebreak, for free, on his own weekends, patiently walking teenagers and grown men alike through techniques his own father had taught him decades earlier. Walter Higgins had spent a lifetime being the kind of man people quietly owed something to, even if none of them ever kept score out loud, and even if Walter himself would have insisted, if asked directly, that he'd never done anything worth remembering. So when Halbrook Development Group set its sights on Walter's 110 acres, perfectly positioned as it turned out, for a new stretch of highway-adjacent retail and housing they wanted to build, nobody in town expected it to go smoothly, though few could have predicted exactly how it would eventually unfold. Halbrook's regional director, a sharp, fast-talking man named Curtis Reyes, had built his entire career on exactly this kind of acquisition, moving from county to county identifying underleveraged rural land near growing highway corridors and finding whatever combination of pressure and paperwork got landowners to sign. He expected an old widower alone on a farm, with no legal team, no leverage, and no real understanding of what his land might actually be worth to a company with deep pockets and deeper patience. It was, by his own internal estimate, one of the easier acquisitions on his current list. The first offer came by mail, polite and professional on the surface, offering what sounded like a generous sum for the land, until Walter had his nephew, a paralegal 2 counties over, actually run the numbers against comparable recent sales in the area. The offer was roughly 1/3 of the land's genuine market value, banking on the assumption that Walter either wouldn't know better or wouldn't have the energy left to push back after so many years of quiet, steady routine. Walter declined politely, in writing thanking Halbrook for their interest, but explaining plainly that the land wasn't for sale at that price, or, frankly, at any price he'd yet been offered, and went back to his morning chores expecting that to be the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. Over the following month, the pressure shifted from polite to considerably less so. County zoning officials, several of whom Walter later learned had received unusually generous campaign contributions from Halbrook-affiliated political action committees, began raising sudden, aggressive questions about decades-old barn permits and fence line variances that had never once been an issue in 52 years of continuous, unremarkable compliance. A county assessor re-evaluated Walter's property taxes upward by nearly 40% within a single assessment cycle, an increase that would have made the farm financially unsustainable within 2 years if it held, forcing a sale not through direct pressure, but through simple, grinding financial attrition. It didn't take a legal expert to see the pattern forming, a slow, deliberate squeeze designed to make selling look less like surrender and more like simple common sense, the kind of quiet, bureaucratic pressure that rarely made headlines precisely because it was built to look ordinary. Walter, for his part, didn't panic and didn't call a press conference or hire an expensive lawyer he couldn't really afford. He did what he'd always done when a problem got bigger than he could handle alone. He drove into town, sat down at the counter of the old diner where he'd eaten breakfast most mornings for 30 years, and mentioned, plainly and without much drama, what was happening to anyone who happened to ask how he was doing that particular morning. He wasn't looking for sympathy, and he certainly wasn't looking to make a scene out of his own troubles. He genuinely just needed advice on which lawyer in the county actually knew anything about zoning disputes, figuring someone at that counter would have a name worth trying. What Walter didn't fully account for was just how many people in that diner, and in that town more broadly, had been quietly keeping score of their own for years, in the particular way small towns often do without ever saying so directly. Daniel Ostrowski, one of the young farmers Walter had loaned equipment to a decade earlier when he was just starting out with barely 2 acres to his name, now ran a small but genuinely successful agricultural consulting business 2 towns over, and he immediately offered to help document exactly what the assessor's sudden re-evaluation actually looked like on paper, compared to standard county procedure. Rosa Delgado, whose husband's mortgage Walter had quietly covered during that brutal winter years back without either of them ever fully repaying him in any formal sense, turned out to now work as a paralegal at a respected firm in the county seat. And she spent an entire weekend, entirely unpaid and mostly unasked, pulling together the county's own zoning records going back 15 years to establish a clear, methodically documented pattern of selective enforcement that seemed to appear only after Halbrook's interest became known. Word moved through town the way it always did in a place that's size, fast and mostly accurate. Passed between the feed store and the church parking lot and the diner counter, until it had reached nearly everyone within a matter of days. Within 2 weeks, an informal but genuinely organised group had assembled around Walter's kitchen table most evenings, working late into the night by lamplight over coffee and whatever leftovers someone had brought along. A retired county clerk, who remembered exactly how zoning variances were supposed to be processed under proper procedure, a local reporter for the county's small weekly paper, who'd started quietly asking Halbrook's regional office pointed questions nobody, there seemed eager to answer directly, and 3 separate volunteer firefighters Walter had trained years earlier, now bringing friends and neighbours of their own who'd simply heard what was happening and wanted to help however they reasonably could. Curtis Reyes, watching his carefully orchestrated pressure campaign start to unravel in ways he hadn't anticipated or budgeted time for, made what would turn out to be a serious miscalculation, one born mostly out of genuine surprise that a farmer he'd assumed was isolated actually had this much organised support behind him. He'd handled dozens of similar acquisitions across the state over the years, and in nearly every case, the pattern held reliably quiet pressure, a slightly inflated tax bill, a few uncomfortable zoning questions, and within a few months, a tired landowner simply signed and moved on with their lives. Walter's situation, he assumed, wouldn't be any different, and he told his own supervisors as much when they asked for a status update that month. Assuming the growing local resistance was mostly noise that would fade once the paperwork moved forward, he pushed the county zoning board to fast-track an emergency variance hearing, betting that a poorly attended weekday morning session would let Halbrook push through the necessary paperwork with minimal public scrutiny before Walter's makeshift support network could properly organise a coordinated response. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock in a small county meeting room that normally sat maybe 30 people comfortably on a good day. Curtis Reyes arrived early, expecting to see Walter, perhaps a modest lawyer and an otherwise empty gallery, exactly the low-visibility outcome he'd been counting on when he'd pushed for the accelerated timeline. What he found instead, walking through the door that morning, was a room packed well past capacity. Chairs pulled in from adjoining offices, with an overflow crowd standing in the hallway outside straining to hear, watching intently through the open door. Daniel Ostrowski stood up first, presenting a clear, methodically documented comparison between Walter's 52-year clean permit history and the sudden, unprecedented scrutiny that had appeared literally within weeks of Halbrook's first offer landing in Walter's mailbox, laid out in simple, easy-to-follow charts anyone in the room could understand at a glance. Rosa Delgado followed immediately after, laying out 15 years of zoning board records showing that no comparable property in the county had ever faced this kind of rapid-fire reassessment without a documented complaint triggering it first. A pattern so clean and so specific to Walter's case that a few audible murmurs moved through the crowded room. The retired county clerk, speaking without notes and with the quiet authority of someone who'd processed exactly this kind of paperwork for 30 years, calmly explained precisely which standard procedural steps had been skipped entirely in fast-tracking this particular emergency hearing. The local reporter, sitting quietly in the second row through most of it with a notepad she barely needed to glance at, had done her own homework thoroughly in the weeks prior, working her own sources at the county clerk's office. She'd already confirmed, through public campaign finance records freely available to anyone willing to actually dig through them, the exact timeline connecting Halbrook-affiliated contributions to two of the zoning board members now sitting at the front of the room. She didn't need to say much when her turn came. She simply asked, on the record, in front of the entire packed room, whether either board member intended to recuse themselves given the documented timing she'd just laid out plainly for everyone present. The room went very quiet after that question landed, the kind of silence that seemed to stretch on far longer than the few seconds it actually lasted. Curtis Reyes, watching a fast-tracked, quietly engineered hearing turn into exactly the kind of public scrutiny he'd been specifically trying to avoid from the very beginning, requested a brief recess that stretched into nearly 45 minutes of hushed, increasingly tense conversation out in the hallway between Halbrook's legal team and the two zoning board members whose names had just been raised so directly and so publicly. When the hearing finally resumed, the board voted, unanimously and without further discussion or debate, to deny the emergency variance request entirely, citing insufficient documented justification for departing from standard review procedures under these particular circumstances. It wasn't, on its own, the complete end of Halbrook's interest in the property or their broader development plans for that stretch of highway. But it was, unmistakably, the end of the quiet, behind-closed-doors pressure campaign that had assumed nobody would ever notice, connect the dots, or bother organising any kind of coordinated pushback. In the weeks that followed, with the manufactured zoning pressure now publicly exposed and thoroughly documented in both the local paper and, soon after, a regional outlet that picked up the story, Halbrook's corporate legal team quietly instructed Curtis Reyes to shift strategy entirely and distance the company from any further association with the earlier tactics. Rather than risk further public scrutiny, possible litigation, or lasting damage to the company's reputation in a county where word travelled remarkably fast, Halbrook returned to Walter with a genuinely fair market offer for the land, one that finally reflected its actual worth rather than a deliberately lowballed opening bid designed to exploit an assumed position of weakness. Walter, notably, still declined the improved offer. Having watched an entire town rally around him without ever once being asked to, having remembered clearly and vividly exactly why he'd built the life he had out on that hill in the first place, he found he no longer had any real interest in selling at any price Halbrook or anyone else might eventually offer. Instead, working closely with Daniel Ostrowski's consulting connections and a small regional land trust Daniel had put him in touch with, Walter began exploring a very different kind of arrangement entirely. A conservation easement that would permanently protect the farmland from any future development while still allowing him, and eventually Marcus and his own children after him, to keep working it exactly as the family always had for over half a century. The easement went through within the year, backed by a regional land trust genuinely moved by the full story of what had happened, and by a formal county apology prompted largely by the local reporters' continued and persistent coverage, publicly acknowledging the improper zoning pressure that had been applied against Walter specifically. Walter's property taxes were quietly readjusted back to their proper, accurate level, and the two zoning board members, whose contributions had been publicly questioned, that Tuesday morning quietly chose not to seek re-election when the following cycle came around. Word of what happened on Walter Higgins's farm spread well past the county line eventually, picked up by a regional news outlet interested in the broader statewide pattern of development pressure tactics used against long-time landowners across similar rural counties, and later referenced briefly in a state legislative hearing about protections for agricultural landowners facing similar zoning pressure elsewhere. But in town itself, people talked about it in simpler, more personal terms than any news article ever managed to capture. They talked about Daniel and Rosa and the retired clerk and the volunteer firefighters who'd shown up, and about a man who'd spent 50 years quietly helping people without ever once expecting anything back in return, discovering all at once just how much that quiet, unspoken decency had actually been worth when it mattered most. Walter still farms that same 110 acres today, a little slower than he used to be, with Marcus now handling most of the heavier seasonal work, while Walter focuses on the parts of the job he still genuinely loves. Walking the fence lines at dawn, checking on the cattle, sitting on the porch some evenings just watching the light change over land his own father once worked. The old stone farmhouse still sits at the top of the hill, exactly where it always has, weathered but sturdy, much like the man who's lived in it for over half a century. Most mornings, Walter still drives into town for breakfast at the same diner counter, where half the people who walk in still remember exactly what happened that particular Tuesday morning, even if nobody makes much of a show of bringing it up anymore. Content instead to simply nod at Walter across the counter the way they always have, the debt long since settled without either side ever needing to say so out loud. Some people spend a lifetime quietly keeping score of debts they never actually intend to collect on, simply because it's the right way to live, regardless of whether anyone ever notices or pays them back. Walter Higgins never once asked anyone in that town to remember what he'd done for them over the years. He never had to. Some things, it turns out, a whole town remembers entirely on its own, carried quietly for years without a word, and repays all at once, exactly when it matters most.